that the skills involved in care somehow come naturally to women, that there isn't a particular skill set involved. But we also know that because employers think that women are more likely to take on caring responsibilities, that means they will discriminate against women whether or not they actually have those caring responsibilities. So a woman may not have caring responsibilities, may not have children, may have no intention of having children, but will still face discrimination in the labour market, which means that their careers progress at a slower rate than men. So hence the overall pay gap. And again, that feeds into kind of a loss of benefit for the overall economy. But it also means that women have less time for other activities like politics, which means that women are more likely to be underrepresented in decision-making positions. Even now, while we've had a huge improvement in the number of women MPs, women are still the minority of MPs in Parliament. And if you look at local government and regional government, which is going to become particularly significant with devolution, women are underrepresented in those senior positions in elected office, which means that when policy is made, it doesn't necessarily take into account women's lives. And obviously, all of these kind of gendered forms of inequality for very many women intersect with other forms of inequality to do with race or disability or class or age and so on. So in terms of what should be done about it, we have always argued that an economic approach has to have gender equality at its heart if it's actually going to work, if it's actually going to deliver. And in order to do that, you need analysis and measures of success. You actually need the data. You need to collect and publish the data so it's available for people who are making decisions. But we also need to look at how we can reduce and redistribute this unpaid care. So that involves investment in social infrastructure, particularly care services. It involves flexible working to enable both men and women to combine paid and unpaid work. And it involves thinking about how our leave policies encourage or discourage men to do more care work. So at the moment, you know, we have women are entitled to a year's maternity leave, men are entitled to 2 weeks paternity leave. There is shared parental leave, but the take up of it is extremely low. Men don't have an entitlement in their own right. They only have it if their partners are entitled to maternity leave. And the rate of pay is so low that in most couples, because women are the lower earner, it doesn't make economic sense for the man to take that leave. So if we're going to encourage greater sharing of care, we know from experience in many Scandinavian countries that actually having a period of leave dedicated to fathers in their own right and doesn't just have an impact in the short term, but has a lifelong impact in terms of men's participation in caring for their children, men, and also men's propensity to pay for their children if the relationship breaks down and to stay in contact with their children if the relationship breaks down. If they've taken leave when their children are small, they're more likely to stay in touch and continue to contribute to those children if the relationship breaks down. So a key part of this, as I said, is thinking about how you can put gender equality at the heart of your economic approach. And that's what I wanted to talk about next, which is some of the principles of gender responsive budgeting and equality impact assessment that you can apply to, you know, any set of policies. It's like a starting point. So the first principle is to look at individuals as well as households. Quite a lot of the data that we have in this country is collected at a household level. We know that interests within households may differ, so that policies that affect one person in the household may not benefit the rest of the household. And this insight was what underpinned the previous Labour government's decision to pay child tax credits to the main carer rather than, as they'd initially proposed, to the main wage earner through the pay packet, because they recognised the extensive research that money paid to mothers was more likely to be spent on children than money paid to fathers, and that it actually mattered who in the household received an income in terms of decisions about how that money was spent. And the who receives income with the household affects decision-making power within the household. So broadly speaking, the more money somebody brings into the household, the more likely they are to exercise decision-making powers about how that money is spent. The second principle is about taking a lifetime perspective. So this is about recognizing that the long-term effect of a policy may outweigh current impacts. A really good example of this from quite a long time ago, but it's still playing out now, was the decision to allow women to pay what was then called the married women's stamp in national insurance contributions. So married women could pay lower rates of national insurance contributions, which in the short term made them better off, but in the long term meant that they didn't have the contributions to build up a full state pension. So there can be decisions that look like they might work better in the short term, but damage people's position in the long term. More recently, you might think about policies around with universal credit, the earnings disregard, which is a household earnings disregard, which is the amount of money you can earn before you start losing universal credit. This acts as a disincentive to second earners, because if the first earner in the household has used up all of that disregard, the second earner has a higher kind of marginal rate of loss of universal credit. So it makes their employment less worthwhile. In the short term, people might think, well, it doesn't matter because so long as the household is able to survive on the income they're getting. But what it means longer term is if women don't enter the labour market or don't have particularly high working hours, if that relationship breaks down, they are particularly likely to be vulnerable to poverty. And we can see this in the poverty rates of lone parents and actually the economic activity rates of lone parents, which are significantly lower than those of other women with children who have partners. The next principle is to take account of the effects of policy on the unpaid care economy, as well as the the paid and formal economy. And there's all sorts of areas where this might come into force. I mean, if you're thinking about transport, for example, often transport policies are based on getting people in and out of town or city centres during the working day. So getting people in the morning and getting people out in the evening, because they're based around the needs of wage earners. And those policies often don't work for women's transport needs, because women are much more likely to do what's called trip chaining. That means they may have, take their child to school before they start work. They may work, they may then come home via a supermarket, pick up some food, take that round to their mother, check in on their mother before they go home. And a transport policy that's based on getting people in and out rather than across towns and around the edges of town can fail to work for women, which means that women may have an impact on their labour market participation, but also may undermine any policies to get people to use their cars less and public transport more if public transport doesn't actually meet the needs of people with care and responsibilities. And finally, equality impact assessment has to look at equalities as a whole. So although I've been talking specifically about gender, it's really important to look within that at particular groups of women and men. For example, differences by race, income, disability, and so on. And I'll give you some examples of some of the analysis we've done that has done that and show you quite how significant those differences can be. So the next thing I wanted to talk about briefly was some of our areas of work where in the past where we've flagged up some particular issues, before I go on to talk a little bit more about some of the missions. So the first is around childcare, early education and childcare. The Women's Budget Group houses the Early Education and Childcare Coalition, which brings together over 30 organisations with an interest in the sector. So that's children's organisations, organisations representing parents, organisations representing business like the Federation of Small Businesses, trade unions, and groups like Save the Children, groups like the Nanny Solidarity Network, or groups representing childminders, to come up with a coordinated position on what we think should happen, because we're very aware that the sector in the UK is in crisis. It's incredibly high costs. Nursery costs for children under 2 cost parents 65% of their weekly wage. A third of people are paying more for childcare than they are in their rent and their mortgage. And this is a major barrier not only to women's labour market participation, but also to children benefiting from early education interventions. And we know that preschool education has the biggest impact on children's life chances. It affects, the state that children are at when they start school, and that has a long-term knock-on impact on their life chances throughout their life. So we've come up with, the Early Education and Childcare Coalition has come up with a manifesto for rescue and reform of the early years sector, looking both at kind of short-term changes to stop the sector from collapsing and longer-term to have something that is sustainable and that works. But some of the other examples of the work that we've done, which I think I want to share because they show the sort of approach that's really helpful when you're thinking about the current government's missions. So one of them is kind of distribution analysis of tax and benefit changes. So this is work that we did a few years ago on the impact of changes to tax and social security from 2010 onwards. And what you can see from this is that poor people lost significantly more than the richest third, and the difference becomes even bigger when you look at deciles rather than tertiles as we have here. We did tertiles because of the sample size. But you can also see that in every income group, women lose more than men, and that Black and Asian women in the poorest income group lose the most of all. And we found the same thing when we looked at the impact of cuts to public services. So that distribution analysis with an intersectional approach, so you're looking at how these different factors interrelate, can really show you that this is going to, as it indeed has, create problems going forward. And this has been one of the major drivers for the significant increase in child poverty that we've seen, which is obviously one of the priorities of this government. Another area of work that we did was around the impact of COVID and the response to COVID, where even before the lockdowns started, we were able to predict many of the problems that we subsequently saw over the following months and years. We knew that women were more likely to be key workers, and they were also more likely to work in some of the sectors that were completely locked down. So retail outside supermarkets, hospitality, and so on. We knew that women had higher levels of debt and were already more likely to struggle with bills before COVID. And so we could forecast that this was likely to, both the lockdowns, the loss of work, the impact of being on 80% of salary if you were furloughed was going to hit women harder. We also knew that women were more likely to be responsible for unpaid care, so the closure of schools and nurseries was going to have a particularly detrimental impact on them. And I mean, actually, there was some research done during COVID that showed that the only household situation in which women weren't doing more unpaid care than men were those where the woman was a key worker and going out to work, and the man had been furloughed. And in those circumstances, they were doing roughly equal amounts of unpaid care. And this had a knock-on impact on levels of stress and anxiety among women. And we're seeing that play through in some of the economic inactivity as a result of mental health problems, which is also, there's been a lot of focus on that impact on younger people because of, partly because of the impact of the lockdowns on people at, in their late teens or early 20s, but it's also had a significant impact on women. Other areas that we've looked at, again, the cost of living crisis. At the start of the crisis, we were able to predict what was likely to happen and the fact that the impacts of the crisis were likely to be gendered as a result of our previous work. And this sort of forecasting, if it takes place in government, can help governments respond more quickly to emergencies like COVID or the cost of living crisis, because they're actually thinking who is most likely to be affected. So we knew that women were already more likely to be living in poverty, had lower levels of savings and higher levels of debt than men coming out of COVID, less flexibility to increase hours of paid work to take account of higher costs. But also we knew that in households, women are what is called the shock absorbers of poverty. That means they're more likely to go without to meet the wider needs of their family. Some other examples, just a couple more of some work that we've done. This was on the impact of the higher rate charge on child benefit. So at this point, this is when child benefit was capped at families earning, where one earner earned over £50,000 a year. And we did some analysis looking particularly at the impact of lone parents and looking at how that £50,000 a year broke down for somebody living in London. So median rent for a 2-bedroom property, monthly full-time nursery place, average cost of energy per person came to a monthly cost that was higher than take-home pay for a lone parent on £50,000 a year. Another area that we look at, and this is slightly different from the economy, so this is looking at data on violence against women, and we're not a violence against women organisation, but we are a data organisation, so this is the sort of thing we would highlight, is what data gets included and what doesn't get included when policies are made. So this is the sort of headline figure from the Crime Survey England and Wales about headline crime figures that included violence, theft, robbery and criminal damage. It doesn't include sexual assault, stalking and harassment, which for very many women, you can see the difference in male and female victims here by the colour of the column. So the red ones are women, the blue ones are men. You can see that many of the crimes that really disproportionately affect women weren't included in that headline figure. So that's back to a question of when you're thinking about making policy, thinking about not just what data have you got, but what isn't included in that data. And finally, just as something for anybody who might be working on policies more at a local level, and looking particularly at engagement with local women's organisations, we run a local data project, which is about enabling women to find, analyse and use local data about things that might affect them. And we provide free training workshops. This cartoon is, we had a cartoonist attend a workshop that we did on the census, which we're now rolling out across the country. So this was groups of women looking at census data from their local area in order to feed into local decision-making processes. So I'm just going to stop sharing now, and hopefully you can all see me there. So what I thought, what I was trying to do was really focus more on the kind of principles and approach rather than getting into the detail of the missions. But I'm very happy to talk about any of those in detail if people are interested, and talk through what our issues are under each of them.
That was really fantastic. Thank you so much, Mary-Ann. So yeah, I mean, I was really struck by some of those statistics you were bringing out there. I mean, especially those violent crime ones at the end were really quite remarkable that those aren't being included in like the headline violent crime statistics. And I think there's a lot to reflect on about the proposals you were making about how we do analysis. I don't think it's the first time that analysts in government have been told we have to think more long term. So I think this is stuff like that is really important to reflect on. So yeah, it'd be great to, I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions. So I'm happy for people to just put their hand up or put things into the chat. Oh, we got one already. Josie, do you want to go ahead? And if you'd like to put your camera on, that'd be great, but otherwise you don't have to.
Hi, thank you so much, Mary-Ann. That was a really interesting presentation. I just had a question. I think you had 2 slides, one about how women are affected by long-term sickness, and the one after about family care. Was the long-term sickness slide referring to women are more likely to have a long-term illness? I was just wondering if there's a sort of intersection between family care and long-term sickness, because I interpreted it as women were looking after people that had long-term sickness. And I would have thought that would also be including like family care.
Yes, so those 2 charts are showing slightly different things. So the first one, the sort of time series data, is showing the number of people who are economically inactive because of long-term sickness, and that's disaggregated by sex. So you're looking